Welcome. Good morning and good afternoon. Welcome to the Society of Wetland Scientists webinar series. My name is Louis Mantini and I'm your moderator for today's webinar. I have been with the webinar committee for 5 years and currently work as an environmental scientist at the Swanee River Water Management District in Live Oak, Florida. We're very proud to provide this e-learning experience in order for you to all remain engaged with the wetland community and have the opportunity to earn continuing education credits. Today's lecture and topic will be an overview of the history and breadth of wetland management practices. And it is my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Andy Nyman from Louisiana State University. Andy's wetland experience began when he worked 8 days on and 6 days off at Louisiana's Pass-a-Loutre Wildlife Management Area, collecting data, assisting researchers, and enforcing regulations. Since then, he earned his MS in wildlife from LSU and a PhD in oceanography and coastal sciences, also from LSU. You may also know Andy as our current chair of the SWS Wildlife section. He's co-authored 86 peer-reviewed publications focused on coastal wetlands, and his research spans waterbird ecology, waterfowl habitat management, and wetland restoration. But his most cited papers from 1993 and 2006 were instrumental in leading today's paradigm in which some coastal wetlands, although initiated on mineral sediments, can survive centuries of local subsidence and global sea level rise by biogenic vertical accretion. So without further delay, I'd like to present to you Dr. Nyman.
All right, I'm going to ask you to stand by for just a second, Louis, to make sure that I am sharing my screen. Am I sharing my screen? Let's see.
You're sharing the sidebar.
Okay, well then let's see now if I do this. This works so much better when we were in practice mode.
You're sharing the screen.
Now?
There you go. All right, got it.
All right, good. There we go. All right, well, I want to thank the webinar committee for the invitation, and I want to thank the audience for being out there. And I'm going to go ahead and start with a couple of basic background slides, 4 slides, get some basic information, because this is going to be a video that's available to use later, and I may use it in teaching for undergraduates who are just kind of getting into a wetland. So first we'll get some background, and then I'll get into the history and breadth of wetland management. So there's a lot of valid wetland definitions. My go-to definition is one that is a place that has vegetation that's adapted to flooded soil, and what separates a wetland plant from an upland plant is the ability of a wetland plant to snorkel oxygen on down inside itself to keep oxygen to the roots. An upland plant can't do that. In a flooded soil, the bacteria in the soil use up all the oxygen, and the upland plant root die. So anyway, that's we're talking about wetlands. Wetlands make up a very small part of the lower 48 states of the United States, less than 5%. That's these areas you see in green here. And certainly Canada's got a lot, Alaska's got a lot, but the lower 48, this only about 5% of our landscape there. If you look at that 5%, you'll see most of that 5% is what we call freshwater wetlands, inland wetlands, and only about 5% of that are coastal wetlands, or the estuarine areas where coastal waters meet fresh water. If you look at where our wildlife refuges are, you'll see that about 1/3 of them are coastal. Now a lot of that's in Alaska and Hawaii, but look at the coastal wetland. And so the coastal wetlands are kind of the rare, but they're extremely valuable for a lot of reasons, and wildlife is one of them. So we're talking about wetland management today, and these are wetlands. I got into this. This is definitely outside my this topic is not something that I ever set out to do until Ken Krause, who one of the editors of this book, invited me to write a chapter for this book in which he wanted me to address, the history and breadth of wetland management. And it has been a fascinating period of learning for me once I got into it. I want to point out that this book has 17 case studies in it on managed wetlands and how those wetlands are affecting either carbon storage or greenhouse gas emissions, CO2 and methane. So it's an interesting book for that reason, might be useful for teaching. There's also some 8 introductory and concluding chapters. The publisher allows an electronic version, and so my university has an electronic copy which can simultaneously be checked out to multiple people. And so it's easy to obtain if you're on a university campus that has a book in its library. But anyway, so I'm telling you, this was fascinating for me. I was reading all kinds of stuff because I want to do a good job of this, and I want to share some of that with you today. And so I got to give a definition. What do I mean by wetland management? Because there are probably quite a few valid definitions out there. But for me, it's managing disturbance and succession or stressors like flooding stress or salinity stress, resources like the water itself, nutrients, to improve the quality of the wetland or the quantity of a wetland function. And that's how I'm defining it. Certainly there are other possible definitions, but that's for the purpose of this chapter, that's how I'm defining wetland management today. The motives for wetland management span, all the functions. We manage wetlands for can be managed for sustainable timber harvest or grazing, habitat for wildlife, whether it's an alligator that never leaves or ducks that fly from the Arctic Circle to equatorial areas, habitat for resident fish and amphibians to estuarine dependent fish, like salmon, menhaden. Water quality improvement, whether that's surface water or groundwater, river water, tidal water. We manage wetlands to hold floodwaters so that we don't get them in our houses as much. And we're beginning to manage them for carbon storage as well. So there's a lot of motives out there for managing wetlands. And one of the first things I realized as I was doing all this reading to try to think about that is that increasingly wetlands depend upon people. When I first read that in one of the papers, whose author I forget at the moment, I thought, what does he mean? But then it kind of comes together with this picture. This is a part of Louisiana. This is a bottom hardwood forest. You got about 5.5 miles of the boundary here between this wildlife management area and this agricultural field. And if it wasn't for people protecting this in the form of ownership and then enforcing that ownership, this area would also be put into agriculture. And so the first thing is to protect a wetland from all the other things that we can do with our landscapes. But it's not enough. Once you start doing that, often you realize that this landscape that you're protecting is attached to the rest of the landscape. It's attached to surface water, it's attached to groundwater, it's attached to fire burn compartments. And just because we put up a boundary here doesn't mean that the water levels are natural in here anymore, or the ground elevation is natural anymore. Doesn't mean that a lightning strike is going to burn this area at the natural frequency that it used to burn. It doesn't mean nutrients aren't getting in. And so, ideally it would be nice not to have to manage wetlands, but increasingly, because of the landscape has been so humanized, I understand the need to manage the desire to manage most of the wetlands that are protected nowadays. So the naturalness, it sounds so weird. I'm burning this wetland to make it more natural. Well, yeah, without the roads and whatnot, the lightning strikes would have burned it every 3 to 5 years. Not that particular wetland, we just talked about the pine wetland. But having a natural fire regime in today's altered landscape often requires setting the fires. Having a natural flood regime often requires now levees and water control structures. And so trying to make things more natural in many cases requires some type of management because the landscape is no longer natural. Here are some of the things that we do. Prescribed fire is common in coastal marshes, pine flatwoods. We prescribe grazing has gotten to be something. We do this on the Southeast Texas and Southwest Louisiana. This is Latvia in Europe, Northern Europe. This is Italy. We reconnect floodplains to the rivers that we've isolated from the rivers. This is a 16,000 acre farm in North Louisiana that has been reconnected to the river. The river water levels are no longer natural though. They're 30 feet higher sometimes than they were naturally. And so what they did here before they reconnected it, they spent well over a decade, almost 2 decades, planting a wetland forest, because otherwise you would never get a germination event in there once it's reconnected. But then they eventually opened it up and it's now freely connected to the river. Up in Illinois, they had to handle that problem differently. They put in a water control structure because simply reconnected it would have left a really deep pool of water out there that would, the water levels would not be natural, wouldn't get the vegetation. So they managed the water levels to make the reconnected floodplain more natural than it would be otherwise. We restore freshwater inflow to coastal marshes. This is down in the Yucatan. I took this picture. I'm standing behind me as a channelized freshwater, artificial channel that carries fresh water out past the coastal swamps that it used to flow through. And these pipes restore freshwater inflow to part of that landscape. We also, in some coastal wetlands, we have artificial saltwater intrusion, oil and gas canals, navigation canals. And so here in Southwest Louisiana, they have a pipe, but they have a flap on it to exclude the artificially low water levels and the artificially high salinity that accompanies that artificial tidal action. On the inside of some structures now, we have these stop log structures. You can stack all the logs up and keep the managed wetland flooded more. You can bring it down and drain it completely. It allows a lot of flexibility in how you're going to manage the water levels in the interior. We use rivers to try to restore coastal deltas. Here is some cuts in the levee, sediment diversions, crevasses we call them, created in 1986 when I was working down here at the mouth of the river. And since then, those areas, those actions have created, almost 1,000 acres of wetlands that weren't there before. Sacramento Delta, similar types of things are being planned and other types of restoration just to restore fresh water to parts of the marsh that no longer have it because of our levees and whatnot. We use heavy equipment to build wetlands where there was formerly open water, as you see back here. I'm hoping y'all can see my cursor. Put sediment in and fill up open water. This one is actually south of New Orleans. Here's New Orleans in the background. Those sediments came from the Mississippi River, pumped over and created, I think 300 acres, almost 430 acres, if I remember right, of wetlands here. A lot of heavy equipment, a lot of diesel involved in those types of management. And we create wetlands that aren't intended to be natural in any respect. They're totally focused on fresh water, improving water quality. So we've got this tremendous range of activities that we do in wetlands that classify as wetland management. I'm just fascinated by this, and I enjoy reading about these things all the time. But as I learned all this, I got increasingly curious about when did all this start? How long have people been doing these types of things? When did this begin? All right, so here we go. Some of the oldest reports I could find of how people messed up, got into, manipulated, managed wetlands goes back to this book here. Certainly not the only one that addresses the topic, but look at this title: The Transformation of Coastal Wetlands, Exploitation and Management of Marshland Landscapes in Northwest Europe During Roman and Medieval Periods. This is some really old technology. People have been messing with wetlands, tweaking them for centuries. The Mayans did it here in Central America. Certainly, the Fertile Crescent. We had it Asia, throughout China. This is not. We assume these technologies have been around a really long time. Look at this. So this is a tidal system here, a ditch and a tidal wetland, and they've got a pipe through it. and they've got a flap on the end of the pipe to keep the salt water from going back into the drainage ditch at high tide. But every low tide, some more water can drain out. And they've dug up these things and described them and drawn pictures of them. You can see where the flap hangs over the end of the pipe. The pipe is actually a single tree. Oh my gosh, my cell phone's ringing. Let me silence my phone. The one thing I should have done before I started this talk. But this is a solid tree. They made pipes out of solid trees, and someone had to, I guess, reach their arm in there and carve this thing out. Here's where the flap hung over the end, and they would join two pipes together. I have no idea how they minimize the water leakage between them on pine sap, or who knows. Technology is lost to us now these days, I would imagine. These technologies evidently stayed in Europe and crossed the Atlantic and came over here to North America. Certainly the Mayans were doing similar things. But this is from the Bay of Fundy, where the Acadians came from France into Canada and drained the wetlands, coastal wetlands up there for agriculture. This is a solid single pine tree. They didn't hollow it out. They made a big U shape and then covered it with boards, and they had a flap on the end to keep the tides out. And so people have been doing this kind of stuff for a long time. And I really like what Ripon did to talk about how people have changed wetlands. He has this pattern that he describes, where people first are, where he calls it exploiting the wetland. They're going and taking something out of it. They're taking hay out, or they're putting grazing animals in. They're taking salt out a lot of times. And then they start modifying the wetland to improve something that they want. They get more salt out, get more hay out. Got to reduce flood stress or salinity stress if you want more hay. And then they go ahead and transform the wetland into not being a wetland anymore. And that's a pattern that is fairly common in the way people have done wetlands. But it's important to realize that just because they start exploiting does not always mean they're going to end up transforming the wetland. And that's because it just didn't make economic sense. You might have a beautiful wetland that could be brought into agriculture, but you would have to put 10 miles of levee around it in order to put it under agriculture to drain it. And you don't do it there. And another wetland that's surrounded on three sides by uplands, you only need to put a levee across one side of it, for example, and that's the one that would be transformed. Or maybe you could easily transform it, but you're just too far from a market, no one to buy your cattle or your hay. And so worldwide, we still see wetlands that are they've been exploited, they've been modified, but they have not yet been transformed. And now Ripon considered this modification to be wetland management, and I don't, because to me that they're not managing it for a wetland function. They're just settling for the wetland function until they can get the transformation. As soon as they get the chance, they are going to transform it. So I don't think of that as management. Other people might. And so, we've got people have been using natural wetlands since prehistoric times. They've been modifying them since, prehistoric times, and they've been transforming them since prehistoric times. But when did they really start managing them? When did they have the option to drain it, but instead have kept it as a wetland? That's the question that I kind of started really wondering about. It happened pretty late, at least here in North America. This Donahue paper here, which is one of the best titles for a paper ever. Look at this title: "Dammed at Both Ends and Cursed in the Middle. The Flowage of the Concord River Meadows, 1798 to 1862. Very interesting paper. But he cites this Clift report from 1862, which is available. And Clift talks about how as soon as people could drain a wetland, as soon as it became economically feasible, they would do it. And that's just the way it was up in the late 1800s, at least that late. So that's quite a long time. I thought it was going to be a lot earlier than that. I'm going to go ahead and give you the punchline now, and then I'm going to explain it to you. But as far as I can tell, wetland management began with wildlife management. And now let me show you some of the reasons why I've come to that conclusion. And I hope some other people will investigate this question and maybe come to some different conclusions, because then I'll learn something new. That requires, though, I got to give you another definition. So what's wildlife management? This definition is from 1980 from the Wildlife Techniques Manual, which edition? I forget which edition this was. Early, well, I think the third, fourth edition. We're up to like the seventh, eighth edition now. But he says that wildlife management was either habitat management or application of harvest strategy to maximize quality and quantity of the population. I summarize that today's language of saying it's either applied plant ecology or public relations, political science, and point out that both of those are data driven. I'm not trying to denigrate the population management side of it all. Trying to get people not to shoot this, but to shoot that. Don't introduce exotic species. That's too hard for me. I'd go with the applied plant ecology. That's mostly what I do. All right, so I think wetland management began with wildlife management. So here's why. This publication here was part of the 1910 Department of Agriculture yearbook. Oldest was trying to save market hunting. Back then, it was legal to go out and shoot as many animals as you wanted to, and then bring them back and sell them to people who would, cook them for their dinner. And he was trying to save that industry, and that industry was threatened by overharvest, one, loss of habitat, two, and then wasteful harvest. Well, the three things he said are causing the death of that industry. And it's important to realize that the population of the country in 1900, when they were overharvesting wildlife, was only 1/4 of what it was in 2000. Absolutely amazing. Amazingly easy to overharvest these animals, and also points out some of the successes we've had managing wildlife and managing hunting mortality in the century after this. But he failed. He was not able to save market hunting from overharvest. In 1914, you get this paper here, 5 important wild duck foods. Now, certainly, I assume that humans were cutting open the stomachs of animals they killed for their pot for as long as humans have been humans. You cut out, what does it eat? What does that plant look like? Where do I see those plants? Where should I stop to hunt? Well, where I find these kinds of plants. Trying to understand food habits is an age-old thing. This is just one of the first ones that I saw studied. The first food habit study I know of was from 1915, and that was from a Texas horned lizard, not a wetland species as far as I know. But this is the first from a wildlife species, and they're focused on ducks. And then they were looking nationwide. Then they started by 1917, they're trying to grow them like you would, crops or ornamental plants. And a year later, they're talking about, well, we can go ahead and plant these things and attract birds to cemeteries and college campuses and the roadsides. And that didn't turn out too well. Didn't prove effective. 1918, this is the first food habit study of a single wetland species that I know of. And they mentioned that this information on these food plants could also be useful in improving water and marshes for ducks. So they're definitely thinking about managing wetlands for ducks. They probably were already doing it, but that's the only sentence that I could find in this report where they actually hint or talk about or allude to wetland management. Got to go to 1928 for the first sentence, the evidence I can find that people are actually explicitly talking about wetland management. This is from 1928, a Louisiana author. And I want to point out that this is not a typo up here. Back then, wetlands was not a single word, it was 2 words. So if you want to find the oldest publications on wetlands, you also need to include search for wetlands as 2 words. And the same is true for wildlife. Wildlife was 2 words. It was not it did not become a single word until the 1950s, I believe. So anyway, he wrote that we cannot legislate banishing species back into existence, and we must look to their conditions of life and relations to their surroundings for the key to the solution of this problem in conservation. This is not a brand new idea at all. This idea has probably been around at least 30 years. I want to show you Carrington's quote from 1895. He was not talking about wetlands, but he was describing, as he described, game preserving. He meant retaining in more or less wild condition large tracts of woodland and heather, which would otherwise be cut down or turned into overgrazed sheep pastures. So a lot of conservation thinking was going on around the planet then, not trying to imply that this was invented in Louisiana. But I want to go back to Biosco's paper, and I want to point out that the problems that he saw and the solutions that he saw are the same problems and solutions that we see today. He's talking, artificial drainage is a problem in many coastal wetlands because they've been channelized, which allows the low tide waters to become much lower. And so you artificially drain these wetlands. And these talks about that right here. The other thing that we have in coastal wetlands is artificial salinity, the saltwater intrusion. You have these canals that allow the fresh water to drain off, artificially low levels, and when the water fills back up at high tide, it's higher salinity. So he was worried about saltwater intrusion and trying to put the fresh water back. And so using the river water to reduce the salinity in those marshes. And today we talk about freshwater diversions, which the word diversions always bother me. To me, it's a reversion. We're reverting the river flow to the landscape that it built. And then, when you're not by the river, when you're in Southwest Louisiana or other coastal wetlands where you don't have direct river inflow, working, doing your best that you can to offset those artificially low water levels and those high salinity levels with what we today in Louisiana we refer to as hydrologic restoration. And then he goes on to get like a politician and say that if we combine wetland restoration and flood protection, the problem would almost solve itself. That's not a statement I would use. I would say that they are they're generally very complementary. You can and work hand in hand, but it's not going to solve its problem alone. Give you some examples of some of the things that were going on then. This is from Massachusetts, 1938. Much of the coastal wetlands in the country had been ditched in the during the Depression, mainly to get rid of mosquitoes, also to provide employment. But this greatly degraded these wetlands for migratory birds, shorebirds, and waterfowl. And so they recommended low-level dams in these ditches. You don't want to completely flood these the marshes, but you want to prevent this artificially low water levels. And they also mentioned that hay grazing was no longer economically feasible, and that grazing had been low density grazing, and had been very important in creating habitat for a lot of migratory shorebirds. And to make up for that, they recommended fire to replace the grazing. I thought that was kind of cool. By 1942, this summary of management of salt marshes on the Atlantic coast pretty much covers all the techniques that you would talk about today in managing coastal wetlands. And it was 1942. 1956, an estimate of the extent of wetlands in the United States. This is not the very first attempt to estimate how many wetlands there were, acres of wetlands there were in the United States. The first attempt had been in the 1920s, and the purpose of that estimate was to identify lands that could be drained for agriculture. This attempt here, the second attempt that I'm aware of, was an attempt to identify wetlands that are important wildlife habitat. I want to point out that although the focus was on that one function, wildlife, they recognized early on that you can't just manage the wildlife. Back in the 1910s, they're focused on plant ecology and the role of flooding stress and salinity stress and disturbance such as fire. And they also got into something today that is no longer a problem that is no longer evident in North America, but still exists worldwide. And this idea that if you drain a freshwater wetland, you can usually do so with full confidence that you're not going to cause any permanent damage. But if you drain many coastal wetlands, you're going to end up with, today we call acid sulfate soils. Back then they called them cat clays. It's a sulfuric acid formation, and this will absolutely plummet the pH, a lot of acid released all at one time. And these areas become barren for at least years, if not decades. And this is the reason that I avoid farm-raised shrimp, because shrimp farming leads to so many acid sulfate soils worldwide, and they just abandon that area and move on to another one. That's what I've been told. All right, so here's how it goes. Natural wetlands, we don't know when that started. Modified wetlands, way too early, and even completely draining them. But managing a wetland, when you had the opportunity to do something else with it, began in the early 1900s, as far as I can tell. And that's why I think that. I want to take a little focus just on Louisiana, because I wanted to try to understand what research was going on in my backyard. And I'm going to show you the median date of the first 10 peer-reviewed publications reflecting wetland management research in Louisiana. And I already showed you one of them, that 1928 paper. But if you look at the median date for the first 10, it's 1974 before you start seeing that. And I knew that there had to be earlier stuff. And so if you go back to conference proceedings, you can push that back to the 1960s by go back another decade. But I also knew that there had been stuff going on before that. And so then if you go back to the theses and dissertations at Louisiana State University, the median date for those first 10 is 1956. And I've tried to search other universities, but I'm not a faculty member there, I'm not a student there, and so I don't have the full access you need to those libraries. And so I encourage someone out there to get curious enough to try this in their own university or a university other than LSU, because maybe it's going on even earlier somewhere else. But I want to go ahead and show you these first 10 theses and dissertations at LSU that dealt with wetlands. The first was 1934, dealt with succession of plants in a cleared swamp area. They did a clear cut. Actually, you drive past this area. If you've ever been to LSU's campus, the LSU lakes, the Baton Rouge lakes is where that happened. They cleared out a swamp, started having succession in it, and they flooded it to make a recreational lake, and it's still a lake today. That was Department of Botany. The second one came from the Department of Agricultural Economics and Agribusiness. A lot of dollars in this thesis, but also a really excellent description of the ecological dynamics of the coastal wetlands that made them good or bad for muskrat. Muskrat was an extremely important animal economically and commercially for furs. And people in Louisiana ate it as well, but I don't think it was ever really exported. In 1953, Department of Civil Engineering. This is people are starting to do oil and gas exploration out in the marsh. They're trying to figure out how to get machines across it, and I guess some of this information was helpful for marsh buggy development. This was dissertations from geology, sedimentology, and ecology of Southeast Louisiana, an excellent ecological description of Southeast Louisiana time. Excellent recognition of flooding stress and salinity stress and vegetation and how those landforms came to be. 1956, ecological studies of coastal marsh in Southwest Louisiana at Rockefeller Refuge. This thesis came from the School of Forestry, Wildlife, and Fisheries, which is my current department today. My department today is called the School of Renewable Natural Resources. We changed our name about 20 years ago because we gave up trying to educate every incoming freshman class that forestry did not mean lumberjacks, wildlife did not mean game wardens, and fisheries did not mean professional bass fishermen. We've got a name that speaks to more of the incoming freshmen in the 2000s now. There's a School of Renewable Natural Resources. And the next 5 also were all from the forestry wildlife stuff. Here's an ecological study on nutria at Rockefeller Refuge. Here's a study of food habits of dabbling ducks at the Passalute Wildlife Management Area, where I had worked in the 1980s before graduate school. Here's a study of beaver being transplanted into forested wetlands of Louisiana. Remember, beaver have been extirpated from throughout much of North America, and we're still being reintroduced in the 1950s. Measuring and determining the effects of marsh fires. Here's another waterfowl food habit study. So definitely a lot of wildlife research going on at the time. All right, so these are all these things that we're doing to wetlands and how we can classify them. And it started with wildlife, but it would be a mistake to think that this is still a wildlife dominated field. Certainly wildlife is still important in wetland management and wetland research, but you know, wildlife does not own this turf. This is a very rich and diverse field for research, teaching, and employment. I'll get a little ahead of myself. I want to point out all these things, these first 5 up here developed in the early 1900s. It wasn't until later on that we started getting these other techniques to rebuild wetlands, and then constructing wetlands to treat wastewater came in the late 1900s. All right, here's this message that wetlands are research and management is no longer, it's not the turf of wildlife. Here at LSU, there are 19 academic departments and 8 different colleges that contributed to the wetland theses and dissertations through 2008. My department is in the College of Agriculture. I made up about 1/3 of those theses and dissertations. The College of Coast and Environment made up about another 1/3, but you've got, you got 7 other colleges and over a dozen other departments, all contributing theses and dissertations to wetland knowledge. And we've also got like 18 graduate courses spread across 7 departments. And so this is no longer a wildlife dominated world. It was that way maybe in the early 1900s, but no longer. It's a very rich and diverse field of study. And I'm glad for that. I'm glad for that. So in conclusion, management would be unnecessary if the landscape was natural, but it's not. And so often the more you understand wetlands, the more you see how the surrounding landscape is altering those wetlands in undesirable ways. And so we often use management to offset the on-site conditions and off-site conditions that people create on the landscape. And until human populations stabilize, the wetlands are going to continue to experience increasingly altered groundwaters and surface waters, as well as increasing pressure to be transformed into agriculture. I got thinking about this, in this global perspective and looking at how things are happening around the planet, following that old pattern of exploit, modify, transform. And it's hard to argue with transforming a wetland in a place where the people are, very poor and very hungry. It can't argue against it really. And this human population drives that transformation. This paper here got me, taught me that this person thought that the gain in food production from the early 1900s to the late 1900s was based on increasing yield per acre more than on increasing acres under cultivation. But this author, Tays, I assume is how you say her name, looking forward, they didn't see that. They assume that we're pretty much gotten as much out of the green revolution as we can. We can't fertilize any more than we are. We can't pesticide it any more than we can. Genetically, we might be able to get some more out, but to keep up with projected increases in human population, we're going to have to get more acres. And as I was reading that, within a month or two, I read a couple of papers dealing with Canada, and they were talking about areas up there that they're going in clear cutting for timber. And whereas before they would have been left to natural regeneration for the next timber crop in a century or so, instead, often they're now, or sometimes they're seeing areas put into agriculture because the growing season now is barely long enough to allow a crop to come off and produce an economic yield, satisfy a demand for that grain. So, and the other thing kind of interesting about this is that every population projection that I've looked at has the same shape, a continual increase with the projected leveling off. It was that way in 1920, it was that way in 1950, and today here we are at this is a 2020 projection, basically just past year, and we're still doing the same thing, looking at a past continual increase, but projecting that it can't get much more, but we keep on getting many more people, and that's going to put more pressure on the wetlands. It's going to be increasingly important to manage these wetlands, the remaining wetlands, if we want to keep those wetland functions coming off of them. Coastal wetlands face additional uncertainty because of the uncertainty in sea level rise. The models relating CO2 to climate are pretty good. And the biggest, the major uncertainty here is how many people there will be and how much fossil fuel they will burn, how much nuclear will they use, how much tidal energy, solar will they use. That's where all that uncertainty is. So coastal wetlands, which are some of my favorite, it's a bias, but certainly they're important in wildlife, and they've got some threats coming on, and gonna need some help. So that is all I have planned. I've got like twice as many slides as I've shown, and in case there's a question out there I can answer, but that is the end of my prepared seminar. But I'm happy to sit here and take questions.
All right then. Andy, thank you very much. I want to remind everybody to pose your questions in the question and answer pane rather than the chat pane. And I have to admit, in retrospect, in the introductory slides, we probably should have had like some Zydeco or some Cajun music or something rather than the cool jazz. Although I did like the latter.
Oh yeah. That was great jazz, but yeah, next time I'll have to do another one, and I'll bring some Zydeco to the intro.
And I did, on a personal note, I'd like to thank you very much for including the slide of the Econfina River in your coastal wetlands. That's in our water management district in where I work in Florida. And funny thing, just due east of there on the coast, there's a wetland, an impounded wetland, coastal wetland there that's it's called Hickory Mound, and it was pretty much, I'm pretty sure that it was done for wild waterfowl management, and it's really cool. If anyone listening to me and you go back to the slides and look for the Econfina River in Florida, look at where that river comes out into the Gulf and pan due east of there. And what's really cool about that impoundment I found was like, you can look at the signature on the aerial and you can definitely see the difference that the vegetation imparts on those signatures. And when you're standing on the levees, it's really wild too, because you can look out into the natural areas that were not impounded, and you can see those areas that have been impacted by, either extreme events or perhaps saltwater intrusion, sea level rise, but where you actually see a lot of pine stumps and things like that, and the area's now becoming salt marsh. But thank you very much. So
You're welcome.
I'm going to start with a question. This is a good one. I like this. Have you looked at how tribes have historically managed wetlands particularly before European contact. I know there has been some insight into traditional management of prairies and other habitats to prescribe burns, etc., but I haven't readily found information on historical wetland management.
I have not found anything on that either. I took, I searched for that, probably maybe 15, 20 minutes, but the evidence that I've seen is all archaeologicals. And so that's so it has to be preserved. And they'd have done something more than just burning and harvesting. And there's some, if you search for Mayan wetland, you should come up with about a half dozen papers. But it's seen, and they don't explicitly say this, but it's seen that my skimming of these papers suggests to me that it follows the pattern that Rippon described that people were doing in Europe. Is that first they modified a little bit, and then they drained it as soon as they could, because they needed to grow crops to feed their people. And so then it would not be a wetland anymore. And then those things were abandoned. Some of it before the European contact, and then certainly after, you would imagine a lot of that was abandoned as well. So yeah, I wish there was more written about those times. Let's see. Someone asked, let's see, how would wetland management be defined in the future? I don't know. I think that wetlands are going to be increasingly dependent upon people to protect them. And so, I suspect that then means that there's going to be increasingly unnatural water levels from the outside, whether they're unnaturally high or low, unnaturally high, low salinity, nutrients are going to be level. Fire is going to be, it already is a problem. Trying to get a natural fire regime in southeast Louisiana, which we've got some longleaf pine flatwoods that we think burn 3 to 5 years based on tree ring analysis. We assume the coastal marshes burn the same way, but because of all the people, roads, subdivisions, nursing homes, smoke management really restricts the time of year that opportunities to burn. And so burning is becoming, our wetlands becoming less natural because of that. And our management fire may be something we lose as a tool in the future. Coastal wetlands in my area from Katrina. All right, so yeah, there's a big loss of wetlands after Hurricane Katrina, and after most hurricanes, we get a pretty good amount of wetland loss. But there's also, and that always makes the news. Someone can always get a publication out a year or two after that. But if you wait 3 to 5 years, the pattern is pretty clear. The low salinity wetlands that are lost come back. It's very temporary, dynamic wetland. The high salinity stuff, once it's lost, it's lost. And so actually for a while, right after Katrina, one of those first estimates came out, I would always tell people Louisiana had already lost more land, more wetlands than there was in the entire state of the third largest state. I forget what the third largest state is right now. But that was, I was saying that probably around 2010-ish. By 2012, I can no longer say that because we had recovered back so that we have lost we had lost fewer acres of wetlands. So that stuff comes and goes. Let's see, wetland man, let's see, defined in the future, the tribes, Katrina, thanks. Trying to save, yeah, hey, Laura, trying to save Louisiana. Yeah, so I want to take issue with the word save. I want to prolong, extend Louisiana's coastal wetlands. They're not like the uplands that they're going to be there kind of forever for us to protect or turn to a subdivision. The coastal wetlands, at least in southeast Louisiana, actually all of Louisiana, have a natural life. They have a natural birth and a natural life. And my goal is to get the most out of them as we can. Just as my goal is, look, I'm doomed. I'm not going to live forever, but I try to eat healthy and exercise. And there's some things would be silly for me to invest in, but not others. And the same is true of our wetland restoration. There's some things that are just too expensive and short-term gain We shouldn't, I don't think we should be doing other things that we should be doing. We're not, because we're afraid of the upfront cost. And we forget that we can get a whole lot, many more acres of years of habitat for fish, shrimp, crabs, ducks, and whatnot. Ramsar Convention. Yeah, how does that fit into the history of wetland management? It has set the stage for a lot of wetland management, because it does first, it gets that protection up. And without some people to try to protect it, the wetland is going to be more likely to be converted into non-wetland in order to satisfy demand for food. But protection alone is inadequate. I was down at a Ramsar site in the Yucatan, and I've been here at, wildlife refuges here in Louisiana, and the signs look the same. They're in different languages, but they're shot up with bullet holes. And there's just, local people are concerned about, how much they got to spend when they go to the store next month. And they want to go out and shoot their animals that they're used to shooting and that they grew up with. And the fact that there are 4 times as many people there now as there were 50 years ago makes that unsustainable, but they still want to do it. And so the Ramsar has been very good in getting protection started. The management and just the resources to enforce that protection and get people, provide them an alternative to go in on the wetland for firewood, for timber, for lumber to build with, for fish and wildlife. That's a tougher thing to do. I mean, hungry people are going to go get the animals when they need to. That's something that we've got to fix. So Ramsar is definitely a good start and a good link in the chain, but we've got bigger problems to fix. Oh, I reread the questions. All right, so I think I just addressed the question of how the Ramsar Convention fit in the history of wetland management. I think, and that's all the questions I see now.
Andy?
Yes.
This is Lewis. I have one for you.
Yeah.
I was kind of holding a thought regarding prescribed grazing, which I'm not really familiar with, and I don't know that it even occurs in Florida. I do understand, when I've been told that cattle like to key in on maiden cane because it has higher protein relative to some of the grasses, pasture grasses or turf grasses that are cultivated for grazing. But it seems like in upland areas here where national forests or state forests have purchased properties, they've eliminated grazing, and I think one of the reasons is because they want to protect some of the listed forbs or grasses and things like that. And I mean, there have to be similar concerns, in grazing wetlands.
Yeah, and probably even more so because the wetland environment is generally more stressed, might have more nutrients, but generally more flood stress than upland. And so plant recovery is going to be slower for different species, but it's going to be slower because of that. So yeah, the overgrazing is not a part of prescribed grazing. In Southwest Louisiana and East Texas, they describe it as trying to mimic the seasonal grazing of bison, which would be intense but very short-lived. And so this is not a way that a rancher can make a living. There's too few animals on your landscape for it with prescribed grazing. It's possible in Louisiana and these pine flatwoods, longleaf pine, flatwood wetlands. And the guy who stumbled across it said he actually, by introducing a brief, intense grazing, he was able to reduce herbicide application because I can't remember which species were coming up. I want to say privet, but I don't think it was privet. There are some species that were coming up that the only way to get rid of it was herbicide or with cattle, by putting cattle on for just I want to say 6 weeks or so a year. And so how's he make a living? Well, partly he's making a living off of cattle, partly is making a living off of the subsidies provided by, I think it's NRCS for prescribed fire. And then the prescribed grazing, I think, also comes into it too as well. So the prescribed grazing has to be subsidized by the rest of it in order to prevent the problems that you see with overgrazing, because landowner will never make enough money off of prescribed grazing. In Europe, the prescribed grazing there, those two sites that I found, I went looking for pictures earlier this week of prescribed grazing and realized that it's a thing right now in Europe. I'm not sure, and they're talking about it as more as like letting the animals go and do what they want to do as a rewilding. And without the carnivores on the landscape that you had when you had herbivores, they could end up with I would think that they would end up with an overgrazing problem as well if they don't thin out those animals somewhat. But yeah, so yeah, prescribed grazing is different from commercial grazing.
Thank you. I have a couple more questions. What are you doing in the photo on the screen?
Oh, so this is Southeast Texas, JD Murphy WMA, and we were collecting below ground biomass for use in a study comparing how the decomposition rates of cattail, typhus spa, I don't know which species, Scenoplectus californicus, bullwhip, Scurpus californicus for older people, and then also Phragmites, but not the European Phragmites. We have very little European Phragmites on the Gulf Coast. These are this would probably be the land variety of Phragmites. But we want to do that because wildlife managers, you saw a century ago, they figured out which plants made the best waterfowl foods, and then they figured out the natural history of those plants so that they could manipulate water and salinity and fire to promote those species. If someone, hopefully, I would think wildlife managers would be the first to do this, but someone needs to do it. If we can figure out which plant species build peat the best, and then we can understand their natural history, we can manage our coastal wetlands to build elevation and to get a few extra decades out of those coastal wetlands, a few more decades of fish, shrimp, crabs, ibis, egret, alligators, whatnot. And so that's what I was doing. We were collecting below ground biomass. We got about a dozen tubs of it that day and brought it back and put it in little bags and buried it back out in the marsh, and then weighed it when we got it out after it rotted for a while.
All right, roger that on the accretion message there as well. And one last question before we go. How do you see mitigation banking playing a role in the general scheme of wetland restoration and management, especially with regard to wetland quality and ecosystem services?
Oh, on one hand, the wetland mitigation banking scheme we have now is a lot better than how wetland permitting was working in the 1970s and 80s. You know, at that time, every individual who was granted a permit had to do was their mitigation, their offset on their own property, and they didn't know how to do it, and it really wasn't working. And so the system we have now works better than it did before. But if you project how the system into the future, you know, 100 years from now, every wetland left in the landscape will be a wetland mitigation bank because every other wetland will have been developed. I don't know if that's true, but that's kind of how the model I have works in my head. I have seen some really excellent wetland mitigation banks. I have heard there are some that the landowner just puts a fence around and no one can go in, and no one's allowed there. Who knows what's going on? I must admit, I do consulting for wetland. I have consulted for wetland mitigation banks. I've been paid money to help design the elevation, help select the elevation that would give the best response. And I want to make another point that the wetland mitigation banking allows a landowner to retain ownership of the land, make some money off of it, a one-time pot of money really until the bank is filled, but then maybe they can make money off of it from hunting leases or recreational birding leases or something else in the future, and keep those areas kind of natural. And so that might be a good thing. But they're certainly not natural wetlands. But the more natural they can be, the better. And oh, I know what I want to say. And so, I work at Louisiana State University, which is a land grant institution. Every state in the United States has one land grant institution. And one of the things the land grant institution does is they have the extension service, which is to extend the benefits of research to the citizens, in particular the landowners. We started out in farming, 100 years ago. But got into home economics and sewing and dietetics and not just corn and cows. Well, landowners need to know about mitigation banking. It's one thing they can do with their land, and so very few of them know that it's an option. They don't have to turn it into a subdivision in order to send their kids to college, perhaps. And so LSU Ag Center right now is we are in the works to put a wetland mitigation bank on some university property and use it as a demonstration site. But this is the absolute best way that you were supposed to do a wetland mitigation bank. Just like we have a rice research station, we have a sugarcane research station, we've had a cattle one, we had citrus, but we are looking at a demonstration for wetland mitigation banking. But the results are probably all across the board. And I think we need to judge each one on its own, and I'm not yet ready to draw a conclusion and paint the entire activity. Let's see. Got another question?
Well, we're running out of time now,
Okay.
Andy, and we did run over. I want to thank everyone that hung on, because this has been quite enjoyable. If you were not able to ask the question, or if you have something come up, please take note of Dr. Nyman's email address on this slide so you can pose any question to him in the future. Once again, Andy, this has been great, man. Thanks so much for joining us and presenting.
You're welcome. Thank you.
And you all that are still here, please visit our 2022 sponsors websites, see what they're about: Winton Group, Wild Note, Delta Land Services, and In Situ. Coming up, also look at the schedule, please, on the webinar calendar on our webpage or on the SWS webpage. And November, we will have Sandupa de Silva, and December, Dr. John Van Dort and Arne Liesterhuis. So once again, thank you so much for joining us, and don't forget to complete the emailed survey to receive your certificate of participation, and please provide feedback. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Louis.
All righty.